Cullen Murphy, as I'm sure many of you know, is an editor-at-large at Vanity Fair magazine. He was an editor at Atlantic Monthly for many years, and he's in Australia on his book tour for his fabulous book, which I've read, The New Rome, and it's just so exciting for me as the editor of the Monthly. My name's Sally Warhaft, to have somebody like Cullen here to talk to and to be able to share it with you all. I guess the first thing I'd like to know, editor-at-large has always seemed to me like a kind of escaped animal from a zoo. I'm an editor-at-large when I turn my mobile off. What does an editor-at-large do, and have you met George Clooney?
No, but he is one of the few people I haven't met for about 2 seconds.
Could you hurry up and meet him?
When you go to the Vanity Fair Oscar party, which is not being held this year actually, but the people there, 750 people, all of whom you recognize and none of whom you know, and so you do get to meet quite a diverse range of people. But editor-at-large. There's a friend of mine who calls herself a cultural critic, and when asked, well, what does culture critic mean? She says, well, it's kind of license to kill. And I think, in a way, editor-at-large is sort of license to kill too, with the added proviso that I don't have to actually live in New York City where Vanity Fair is. I can be at large. I can be in Melbourne. I happen to live in Boston. So I have that freedom, but also in a way I'm doing some different things at the magazine. I'm not I don't have to be in residence as an editor chained to a desk. I work with a dozen or so writers who are doing very particular kinds of things: politics, foreign affairs, wars, national security, and I work with them individually and get their I think of ideas with them for the magazine. I get them off onto their assignments. I edit their pieces when they come in. I work with the editor in figuring out when those pieces should run. So it's kind of a little sideline business.
So it's a lot of the freedoms and not all of the sort of administrative and other kinds of stresses that the editor has?
That you unfortunately have. Yes, exactly. I was interested in, when you and I were talking just a few minutes ago about your own history. When you have been an editor of a magazine like yours or like the Atlantic Monthly, the commonalities of the job are so stark. It isn't as if there are 12 different models for being an editor of a magazine like this. There's actually one. And one of the interesting things you were saying was how you had actually come to this job really with no preparation for it, which is almost the ideal way to. It's like becoming a parent. If you actually knew, you never would. But I was fascinated to hear how you had actually come to the job and started this remarkable magazine. Maybe you should tell us.
Well, I didn't start it. That's the first remarkable point. I'm the second editor, but I came to it from a background, and I'm an anthropologist, and I worked in India, so my background had nothing to do with publishing or journalism. But I also note that you come from medieval history, so and in fact in our discussion earlier you were saying that there is actually a history of this with editors, which was very comforting for me to hear. I didn't know what a stet was when I began this job. And
does everybody here know what a stet is?
There you go.
Okay.
See, I was behind. I know what it is even in Hindi now, but so it's, I think it's not something you could ever be prepared for, and the stresses are not what you expect. And I wonder if there's something in the sort of American tradition of editing and magazines that this, we've sort of inherited here. I'm interested to know about the specific culture of editing and magazines, where you come from, because the Monthly is very much a sort of, it honours those great traditions of Atlantic Monthly and the New Yorker, and I wonder if there's something about American culture that is particular to magazines.
Well, I can tell you something about how it started in the United States, how this tradition started. But one of the things that your magazine, The Monthly, and the Atlantic Monthly have in common is the number of times people come up to us and ask how often it comes out.
On time, that's my answer.
I've been struck just in going to various parts of the English-speaking world, which I count the United States as part of that. A magazine like The Monthly in Australia is unique in Australia. It doesn't have a lot of competition in doing exactly what it's doing. And if you go to England, you'll find that there's a magazine there called Prospect, which has much of the same DNA, I would say, as The Monthly does. But again, you won't find a lot of competition. You'll find England has a robust magazine tradition, but it's magazines like The Spectator or The New Statesman that come out of a political tradition. The United States actually has lots of these kinds of magazines, like the Atlantic Monthly or Harper's or the New Yorker, and Vanity Fair, Rolling Stone, which are really general interest magazines that are publishing very high quality journalism. And many of them go back for a long, long period of time. The Atlantic Monthly just celebrated its 150th anniversary. And our magazine began really as an attempt to break away from the British model. We never quite had the tradition that the British had of many, many different political parties and factions, each with their own magazine, that in effect became the template for what journalism was. We in the early part of the 19th century, we brought in a lot of those magazines, we read them, but the people who were the elite at that time were very conscious of the fact that everything was being imported, and what could we do to establish our own homegrown kind of journalism. So that was what the impetus was behind magazines like the Atlantic Monthly and Harper's Magazine. Let's just invent something new.
And the Monthly too, I think, it comes from that same space. Yeah.
And so here's another aspect of this, which I bet is the same with you too. So let's say you're back in the 1850s now, and you're trying to create this new kind of animal. You don't have this British type tradition to draw on. You don't have journalists per se of that British kind to use. So who do you get to write for you? And the answer for the Atlantic Monthly was, well, you get people who aren't really newspaper journalists. You get other kinds of people. It's in a funny way, it's kind of amateur hour. You get novelists. You get people who are in business or in government. People who are out in the world doing things. And you get essayists, you get literary types, critics, and so on. So that actually became the core group of people who were doing our writing for us, rather than the journalistic tradition. It's just it's one way in which magazines like this are so different from newspapers, which is actually something we should talk about, because I think people lump them all together under a journalism rubric when in fact it's different phyla altogether.
I think that's true, and in fact when the Monthly began almost 3 years ago, a lot of people said that there'd never been a worse time to start a printed old-fashioned, it's not old-fashioned of course, but the idea of a magazine is quite an old-fashioned idea, and that in the age of the internet and so on, that a magazine couldn't survive. But I think actually it's more difficult for printed newspapers now, where you look for news online as the moment it happens, and you're looking for updates, every 15 minutes if it's something really big, whereas a magazine can't even try to do that. It can't try and beat the news cycle, or it has to always be about quality of ideas and the quality of the writing and being presented really beautifully so that people want to carry it around and read it. So they're so different. And I think too that certainly in Australia that newspaper writing has become much shorter. It's just 800-word columns. There's no real room for length anymore. And also the sort of resources that newspapers are putting into real sort of investigative stories is diminishing. And I imagine that's the same with the American scene.
Yeah, there was a school of thought a few years ago, which I always resisted. I never bought into it, which was that the 24/7 news cycle, the internet, and so on was such a superior form that as a medium it was so immediate, and if you had a scoop you could get it out there instantly. That this medium was actually going to spell the death of all sorts of print publications, and I think it's turning out to be half true. I always thought it was actually the best piece of news possible for monthly magazines, because it defined our role so clearly for us. We were not that. We were not going to be publishing that kind of journalism. In fact, we were kind of the antidote, to that kind of journalism. The real problem is for newspapers, and it's for weekly news magazines, which are the newspapers will all gravitate online, and the weekly news magazines will all die, except perhaps for The Economist. But monthly magazines, the space for us is, we are freer and more important now than ever.
I think that's really true, and in fact, as everyone here will know, the Bulletin magazine, which was 128 years old, it was almost the same age as Atlantic Monthly, unfortunately was closed down a couple of weeks ago. And I think that weekly cycle and trying to be in the news cycle, but not being able to compete with those other forces was one of the main reasons why. And a monthly, it's a very different timeline. You will know this as well as I, that when you're commissioning pieces for a monthly magazine, it's not a 4-week life, of course. It has to last on the shelf for 4 weeks, but it has to be thought of and commissioned and edited and put into its format. So you're talking about months of preparation and being able to try and choose what story will last, what's going to be important, what's not been investigated. I think for the monthly, and I know this is true for Atlantic Monthly as well, some of the most important stories we've published have been stories that were in the news but neglected to be treated in a really serious way. And that's true for you too.
The great advantage, and I want to actually ask you for some examples from the monthly. The great advantage of a monthly magazine is that the way a newspaper reports things, even a great newspaper, a New York Times or a Wall Street Journal, they never have time enough where they can stop and just say, now let's think about this, or now let's really tell this story, because what happens is the earth turns. It's a new day, and new things have been washed up on the shore that they have to turn to. And what that means is, magazines like these are we're beachcombers, and there are all sorts of things that have never been properly covered, and in fact never properly understood. So, how do you think about a story as a monthly editor, and what are some of the big successes for you in terms of pitching a story so that it actually is timely, even though you haven't chased the story? It's looking for perhaps small stories that seem smaller, that in fact when investigated illuminate something much bigger about who we are and where we'd like to be going. One of the great stories that, one of those stories you just read and think, I'm the luckiest person in the universe to have anything to do with this, was Chloe Hooper's essay for us on Palm Island, about a situation up there with a court case that won her a Walkley Award. And it was a story that I think everybody sort of had touched the surface of in the newspapers, and what she did was to write the definitive essay about it. She went there 4 or 5 times. There was nothing missing from this account. A similar thing happened with the punishment of David Hicks, which in fact it was an American historian, Alfred McCoy,
who wrote that story for us. And it was at a time in June 2006, David Hicks had gone off the radar. Nobody was talking about him. And so, my idea was that you have somebody who can put it all together, which he did incredibly well. The links aren't always obvious in thinking about writers. Chloe is a fiction writer, and Alfred McCoy is an historian, but he'd written this book on torture in the CIA. And it looked like a fit to me, that if he was prepared to do the work on this one case study, he could bring what he knew on that broader subject to bear on this. And it was a really huge story for us. The biggest story we've ever had was Faith in Politics by Kevin Rudd, who's now Prime Minister, who I'm sure you know. That was in October. I
thought that was Paul Rudd.
We're waiting for Rudd the musical. Won't be long, I think. Now that piece came about, that piece was published in October 2006, 6 weeks before he became leader of the opposition. That piece came about 2 reasons, actually, that have a lot to do with the sort of things that can stress you being an editor. I'd been looking for somebody to profile him all year, and I just couldn't find a writer that I felt would really do it. I just couldn't find that match. And I was getting quite desperate because I felt like he was somebody who should have had a higher profile at that time and perhaps should have been leader of the party. I thought he was the smartest guy in the room, in the ALP room. Couldn't find anybody to do it, and I became so sort of desperate that's when the idea of asking him to do it himself came to my thoughts, and he agreed to do it. Now, it had to be a very difficult topic. I think that if you're going to allow writers, politicians, to write about themselves, you've got to really challenge them. And so bringing these 2 very tricky subjects of religion and politics together in an essay, I asked him to do it, and I told him if it wasn't something very, very special, we'd just throw it in the bin. To my great joy, I mean, from the first time I read it, the greatest feeling really you get as an editor is to read something when it first comes in and you just know that it's important and it's going to make a difference and it's going to last forever. And this essay really did that. We'd never seen anything like it. And this happens every now and again, and sometimes you expect it, sometimes you don't. In this past year we had an essay again by a novelist on guns, the pulp mill, that caused a lot of trouble in the seat of Wentworth for Malcolm Turnbull. And so I guess it's looking at things that they have to be timely. The monthly, like the Atlantic Monthly, particularly for a monthly publication, you run the risk of being history, of always chasing. So I think you've got to do one of several things. You either have to do something completely new and unexpected, like a Kevin Rudd writing about Christianity really well and interestingly, or you have to provide the definitive essay on a subject that's just not been well treated, and perhaps every now and again you break news, but it's not what you can set out to do with the timelines. Yeah,
and that's exactly right. Those are the two options, and neither of them really is available to a newspaper on a consistent basis. Newspapers can sometimes do both of these things, but mostly they can't do either of them the way a monthly magazine can. That's the purpose of a monthly magazine, either to invent the story that doesn't exist yet, like the Kevin Rudd Faith in Politics, or to do the definitive treatment that no one else can get to. We've had a couple of examples. I'll just give you 2 as kind of analogs to what you were talking about. 2002. Everybody knows that the Iraq War is going to happen, no matter what the Bush administration says about how we haven't made any decisions and so on. Everybody knows it's going to happen. Now, when you are a monthly magazine, trying to figure out how do you cover something like this, you can't avoid the subject, or it looks like you've just abdicated from one of the largest issues facing the nation. At the same time, news is coming out every single day that is advancing the story in ways that you can't predict. Time and Newsweek are coming out with what they call, the battle plans. We can't do something like that. And we're perpetually running the risk of being scooped. So you have to ask yourself, what can you do that in fact advances the story? And what we decided to do was try to leapfrog over the discussion, which is one of the ways of being definitive. Forget about the waging of the war was our thought. Everybody also knew that in a military sense, the coalition forces would defeat the Iraqis in short order. So what happens after that point? What happens after Baghdad falls, which it's going to fall? Has anybody been thinking about that? And so beginning in August of 2002, we're now talking 9 months before the war begins, we began talking to people inside the administration, asking them that question. Have you looked at the number of troops that you need to control a civilian population? We know what that number is in the Balkans. How many are we going to have? What are you going to do about the electricity system? What are you going to do about X, Y, and Z? And we published an article in November of 2002, so again, 6 months before the war, called The 51st State, which was in effect, now that we have responsibility for this place, how are we going to run it? Of course, the administration had ignored all of these questions. It's not that there weren't people down in the ranks of the bureaucracy who weren't worried about and fretting about this all night long, but they were not paying any attention to it, and it wasn't getting any publicity. So it was there was a perfect idea of the kind of thing that a monthly can do, but you have to set your mind in a certain way to be looking for that kind of story.
Did you have any experiences as the editor of that idea coming really undone? Did it ever, where you try and anticipate, I guess I'm asking you stories that never got to print or that got to print and a week later they just don't work? I'm sure you didn't. I can't think of
No, well, I would tell you if I could.
Okay, I'll put it another way. Did you live in a sort of anxiety that this would happen?
Well, I think we probably are both living in perpetual anxiety that something like this is going to happen. But it becomes part of your thinking at a very early stage. You have to gauge what are the chances that somebody else is going to do this idea first, and if the chances are sufficiently good, then it's a signal that you should probably avoid a particular story. But sometimes just going into a story that nobody else is there.
Yeah.
And because a story like The 51st State is nobody was talking about this, and it takes so long to actually report a story like this that once you get it underway, you know whether other people are surfing this terrain, because the people you're talking about would be telling you, oh, a person from Time was here, and so on. So there comes a point where you realize you own this one, and nobody else is there. There was that sense of ownership is really wonderful when you realize, you're looking around thinking, there must be someone else must have thought of this, and no one has. The Haditha massacre, if that term is, it's probably known to most people here, but just briefly, there was an episode in the town of Haditha where American Marines, after a car bombing, went and killed 25 or 26 civilians, arguing that they thought there was a threat to being posed by the people in these houses. And those people are now on trial. Now, the fact of Haditha was reported by Time magazine, and there was some film footage. But Vanity Fair was actually able to get access to some of the people who were there, including Marines. And so we were able to do the kind of story that is, in the business called a tick-tock. Here's what happened at every single moment, and reconstruct the incident. And there was another case of, we knew that other people were not getting access to this. And the purpose of that story actually wasn't simply to reconstruct the event, but it was also to make a higher point, which is one of the things that a monthly magazine also tries to do with every story. Is that there needs to be a takeaway idea, not just a descriptive journalism. And in the case of the Haditha story, it had to do with the tragedy of Haditha was not simply that these 25 people were killed. It was the fact that the rules of engagement by which the Marines, the rules that they were to follow, actually permitted this kind of behavior. It was written in. If you think there's a threat, you are allowed to take the following steps. And it is because, it's to my mind criminal that the rules of engagement are doing this. But it may be that the people will get off because they will be able to show that the standard operating procedure virtually guarantees that something like this will happen. Mm.
I'd like to know about how both the magazines that you've worked for go about choosing writers. At the Monthly, our principle is just the best writers. It's great to have new writers and young writers. It's great to have old writers. But they have to be the best writers. Now, the Atlantic Monthly, Ernest Hemingway, Mark Twain, Henry James,